Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I just flew in last night from CES, and that's in Las Vegas. So before the jet lag and the tiredness and all that stuff sets in, I wanted to do a quick video because I had a ton of things waiting for me on my desk, and one of them was the Miyoo Flip. Now, we've been hearing about the Miyoo Flip for a long time now. It's been over a year since it was first teased. And it is pretty exciting to get my hands on a device finally after all this time. In fact, the Miyoo A30, their horizontal handheld that came out last year, was supposed to come out after the Miyoo Flip. That's how much things have changed over the past year or so. So what I want to focus on in this video is just going to be quick impressions, like the look and feel of the device, and honestly, with a lot of these sub $100 handhelds, how it feels and how it looks and things like that can really change just the overall perspective of it. And so we'll knock out all that stuff here and then give me a week or two to actually play around with it before I make a final review. And it's actually the perfect time to do an impressions video because these things are sold out everywhere. This is from the initial batch run that they did, and these sold out in just a matter of hours. And so now we're waiting for the next batch. And in that time that we're waiting, it's a good time to kind of do a quick impressions and also a review later on. And so without any further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Anyway, let's start with an unboxing, and this unit, as well as the other one we'll be checking out today, came from a third-party supplier called Keep Retro. And you will also be able to buy this device from other third-party retailers as well as from Miyoo directly on their AliExpress store. In fact, as soon as it launched, I also bought a couple other colors directly from Miyoo just because I wanted to get them all for comparisons, but those ones haven't arrived yet, so Keep Retro actually beat them to the punch. Now, like I mentioned, these are sold out everywhere, at least as of making this video, but Keep Retro does have a pre-order page, so if you'd like, you can actually just go to their website. You can pre-order for one of those units, and then when they have it available in stock, they'll send it over to you. Otherwise, you can wait until Miyoo officially restocks it, then go to their AliExpress page and then order it directly from them. So you've got a couple options. So let's start by taking a look at the box itself, and you can see it's bulging a little bit, and that's because there's a case inside of it, and it looks like the dimensions are not quite 100%. Either way, on the box, you can see it is pretty simple. They've got a couple things here to promote it, and then also on the back, they have all the specs. Let's go over those. To start, let's talk about the chipset. So it says Cortex A55 1.8 gigahertz, but it's really the Rockchip RK3566. And that's a chip that we've seen in a lot of handhelds over the years, Ambernics and Powkitties and whatnot. It usually is around $100 to $150 for handhelds that have that chipset. Probably the best seller of all the RK3566s was the Powkitty RGB30. I did a bunch of videos about it, but I really love the square aspect ratio of this device. It's a really neat little handheld, so it's going to have the same chip as the Miyoo Flip. And one of the nice things about having the same chip like this is that custom firmwares that work for this device may eventually work for the Miyoo Flip as well. They just basically have to accommodate for things like, the controls as well as the screen, but it's a pretty easy carryover. And so with any luck, we'll see things like RockNix and ArcOS as well as MinUI for the Miyoo Flip. And in terms of performance, this is going to be a little bit better than the H700 chips that we've seen from Ambernic, the XX line of devices. So, things like the Ambernic RG35XX SP, another clamshell handheld, the Miyoo Flip will be a little bit more powerful than this one. And really what that means is that there are going to be some games that work better on the Miyoo Flip, particularly Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, Sega Saturn, as well as PSP. All those will generally run better on the Miyoo Flip because of that better chipset. However, because we are working with a more powerful chipset, the price on this is going to be a little bit higher. I think Miyoo is asking around $80 for this handheld with free shipping, and I'm not sure what Keep Retro is going to actually be posting on their website. Again, I'll have that one linked down below, but it'll probably be a little bit more, so I'm guessing between like $85 and $90. So in the end, this is actually relatively cheap for an RK3566 chipset at being around, say, $80 to less than $100. Now, we've got a very standard screen here, 3.5 inches, IPS LCD, as well as a resolution of 640 by 480. So it's going to be a 4:3 aspect ratio display. And that's the same that you'll find on a bunch of other devices, including the RG35XX SP. So it's a pretty standard screen size. Also pretty standard here is 1 gigabyte of RAM. Now that might not sound like enough RAM, but for emulation, it's not really RAM intensive. And so this is going to be fine. It'll also work with most ports of PC games as well via Portmaster, which again is one of the great things about having the RK3566 chip. Now, even though we don't have custom firmware available as of making this video, it is running a custom custom OS that we will check out here in a minute, and it also has Wi-Fi 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz. This chipset is also capable of Bluetooth, and it is on the board, but they just haven't implemented it in the software yet. So again, one of the reasons why something like Rocknix or ArcOS might be a really good option for these devices if it does get ported over, because then we can take advantage of all that Bluetooth work that they did before. And then finally, we've got a 3000 milliamp hour battery, which is pretty standard. I would expect about 6 hours of gameplay, and then we have a vibration or rumble motor. So let's actually check out what it looks like inside of the box here. And like I mentioned, it has its own case. And so I'm not sure how often you're going to actually need this box. Now the case itself is of pretty nice high quality, and it's very similar to the original Miyoo 30 that came out last year. It even has this little gamepad, little zipper pull. Anyway, let's take a look inside the case. And obviously we're going to have the device itself. We'll get back to that. But you can see that we have a nice liner inside. It's nice and soft. Also up top, we've got storage for a bunch of stuff. So I've got a Miyoo quick guide. It's going to just walk you through the instructions both in English and Chinese, and it also looks like it comes with a plastic screen protector like those cheap ones that come with Nintendo Switch cases. So again, this one is from Keep Retro, so maybe the official Miyoo one comes with an actual tempered glass, but I definitely would not put this on my device here. It's just going to make it a little bit harder to see everything. And so in my opinion, I would rather not use a plastic film like this just because it kind of takes away from the clarity of the screen. Also inside, we've got a USB-A to USB-C charging cable. We'll talk about charging later. And one other thing, we've got a USB-C SD adapter. So this allows you to put in your micro SD card right here, then plug this into your computer. That's going to be great for transferring games, updating the firmware, stuff like that. So let's take a look at the device itself. And this is the white model, as you can obviously tell, and it has gray buttons. Now, first impression right here is that the plastic texture here is a little bit slick, and I wasn't expecting that. And that's because I've been messing around with the other model that I have, and it doesn't have this texture. And so these are the two models that I was sent over from Keep Retro. And this one here is the gray model, or the Super Nintendo version, that you can see from these buttons. And this one has a different plastic texture, and I really like this one. This one has a more matte texture, so it's a little bit more grippy. Like when I rub it across here, across the top, my finger catches a little bit. And that's exactly what I like with these kind of devices, where it doesn't feel slippery or anything, but it's also kind of powdery and matte. It's also fingerprint resistant, which I really like. And so this is something that I think I prefer when it comes to these textures. Now this one's a little bit different. It's got a slick and somewhat squeaky texture to it. If I actually rub my finger across, I can get a little bit of a squeak going. And so this has a completely different texture to it. It's got some sort of coating or something on the plastic. And so this I do not prefer over the matte one. I like this feeling better than the white one right here. And from what I've been told, the black model, which I don't have, has this same texture. It has this kind of slick texture. And this one, I would guess, is probably more prone to fingerprinting. It's hard to see on a white device, but I am seeing a little bit of smudging and stuff like that. It's probably really hard to show on the camera, but I bet that the black one is probably going to be very smudgy. And I've seen pictures of people complaining about that as well. And so when it comes to plastic textures, even though these are the same device, they have a different feel to them. So that is something to probably be mindful of if you do plan on picking one of these up. I've also ordered the yellow model, and I suspect that it's going to have the same texture as this gray one. So the white and black probably are going to be a little bit more slick and kind of have that squeaky feel to them, and then will also be more smudgy. But if you want something a little bit more powdery, then I would recommend getting this one, either the gray one or probably the yellow one. Again, I've got that one on order, and by the time I do a review, I can give you more information. Anyway, that was my first impression of this device in terms of just the overall plastic textures, that it does feel a little bit unexpectedly different. So let's go around the device and talk about each aspect. We'll start with the back here. So this right here obviously has some text here showing, like the charging indicator wattage and the battery size. And then we've got this ribbed backing right here. It also looks like there's some ventilation on each side. So I expect that this is probably passive cooling to allow heat to dissipate out here. Now, when holding the device, that means that the heat may go directly into your fingers. Again, this will take some testing. I'm not even sure if this device warms up. I've heard it's actually not so bad. And so we will test that in the final review. Again, this is just first impressions. And just in terms of overall feel, I like this rib texture right here. It reminds me of a Game Boy DMG, so I kind of like that classic feel right here on the back. And it's not the first time that Miyoo has done a texture like this on the back. In fact, both the Miyoo and the Miyoo Mini Plus have that same kind of rib texture. So I like the fact that they're keeping up with that same kind of design language. So now let's take a look at the bottoms. We've got a headphone jack as well as a USB-C port. Now, you might be wondering, because there's another one at the top, this one up here is only for peripherals. So for example, like an external controller or, something along those lines. This one is for charging. You cannot charge with this top one as far as I can tell. You're going to have to put it here in the bottom, which I think is actually actually probably better. You can plug it in like this and then continue to play. And so I think that'll be fine. Now, speaking of charging, one of the major issues with the Anbernic RG35XX line in particular is that charging with this can be kind of wonky. By that, I mean that there are some chargers, like USB-C ones in particular, that don't play well with this. And so my general recommendation is to use something that's exactly the same wattage as it requires, which is 5 volts and 1.5 amps. Now, we're going to have to do more testing on the Miyoo Flip, but at least as far as my initial testing, it does seem to be the same case. So if I use just a standard cable here with 5 volts, 1.5 amps, then yes, the device will charge. You can see it goes green right there. And like I mentioned, if I try to plug it here on the top, then no light comes on at all. And so nothing's happening. I think you have to do the charging here from the bottom. Now, I've tried with a couple other USB-C cables and USB-C fast chargers. Like, for example, this one's plugged into like a 140 watt charger from Ugreen. Now, when I plug this one in, absolutely nothing happens. And so there's no charging happening here with some chargers and cables. So that's something to be mindful of. And this is pretty common with these cheaper handheld devices. Now, the interesting thing here is if we use this exact same setup with a USB-C cable and the nice charger, and I plug it into the Miyoo Mini, it actually works. But it doesn't work with the Miyoo Mini Plus or the A30, and so I think this one in particular is just really good when it comes to USB-C charging, but this one is more like the other Miyoo devices where you may have to be a little bit picky about what you actually use to charge it with. And my only point here is that this thing is not going to be perfect. You can't just plug everything into it and it's going to work. You may have to be choosy about which cable and charger you use. So let's move over back to the top. And in addition to that USB-C OTG port that we were talking about before for peripherals, there's also a mini HDMI connection. So you'll be able to plug this into a television. And so that'll be great when it comes to, consoleizing this little handheld. It doesn't have Bluetooth just yet. So you'll have to use the controls that are built in here, or you'll have to use a USB-C controller. And so this is just one of the many things that's probably still a work in progress with the Miyoo Flip, which is very common with Miyoo devices. The Miyoo Mini, Mini Plus, as well as the A30, they all took time and software development to actually come into their own. So yes, already this device can kind of be used as a retro gaming console, but I bet it'll get better in the months to come. Moving over to the left side, we've got our micro SD card slot. This is going to be where you put your operating system. So this one already came with a card and it's 64 gigabytes. And I bet that there are probably some games already preloaded on it as well. Above that, we've got our volume button up and down. And then on the right side, we've got another micro SD card slot. So this one is going to be for storage. So you can put additional games in this one. And this one is blank on my review unit. Next, we've got this little hole, which I bet is probably a reset button. So you take something like a paper clip and then you'd push it down in there to reset the device in case, there's something that's going wrong. From there, up above that, we've got our power button. We've also got the shoulder and trigger buttons, but I think we should talk about that after we talk about these other buttons. So let's move on to this next. So first thing, the control setup here is pretty predictable. It's very similar to the Miyoo Mini Plus. We've got a menu button up top, then our start and select buttons, and then of course our D-pad and face buttons. The main difference here is obviously that the Miyoo Flip has these two analog sticks. Now these analog sticks remind me of the PS Vita. They kind of have the same amount of motion here, and they have this little rubber nub up top. Again, very similar to those old devices. The big difference here is that these buttons do click down for L3 and R3. So if I push down on it, I can feel that solid click. And that's going to be great when it comes to things like hotkeys, or sometimes you'll be playing a game that requires these inputs. And so we have that here. And I know the whole idea of having analog sticks is really divisive in the community. Some people like the idea of having additional input options. Other people think that it makes it look ugly or this is going to be uncomfortable. And I'm kind of split between those two. For me personally, when it comes to playing like analog stick centric games, Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and even things like arcade games, I prefer to use an analog stick. So I'm always thankful when one at least is present. For these types of devices, I don't have a lot of requirement for a second analog stick. This is not something I'm going to do game streaming on, and there are very few games that have a dual stick input anyway. If you're going to be playing, like very specific DualShock PS1 games like Ape Escape, then yeah, that makes sense. But for me, for the most part, I really just need one, and so I'm happy that it's actually here. In terms of the overall feel, yes, it is a little bit limited. It reminds me of an analog stick from the PS Vita era, so something that's like 10 to 15 years old. And in terms of ergonomics, this device is so small that it really doesn't bother me. It's actually pretty easy to reach over and use the analog stick. I probably wouldn't want to play that for like 5 hours straight, but I'm never going to play a device like this for 5 hours in one setting. So I think it actually is an added bonus to have these analog sticks, so I have no problem with them. And also bear in mind that, these sticks do not really stick out from the shell, just a tiny little bit, and that's probably to accommodate the screen, obviously. The screen is inset, so it does have a little bit of room to actually fully close. Now let's talk about the D-pad and face buttons. So these have a clicky kind of texture to them, and it feels very reminiscent of the original Game Boy Advance SP. So very low travel, and it looks like it's probably a dome switch, but it is very, very light to the touch, which I love to see. So Miyoo has always been really good about making sure that their buttons are easy to press down on, and these are very easy to press down on. So let's do some quick comparisons. We've got our Miyoo Flip, we've got the Ambernick, as well as the original Game Boy Advance SP. Now this one is like a third-party shell, and it's probably new rubber membranes and all that. So this is not an original Game Boy Advance SP, it's an aftermarket one, but it's the closest I have for comparisons. Also bear in mind that this is the second batch of Ambernick devices where they did make these buttons easier to press down on and less loud and clicky. And I would say that in terms of just the overall feel of the buttons here, the Ambernicks are still a little bit more resistant than these other two. In fact, these are almost dead ringers for one another. And so if you're looking for something that mimics that original GBA SP feel, then it feels like the Miyoo Flip to me out of the box is a better experience than the Ambernick one. This one is just a little bit more stiff and clicky. Now, this is not a bad thing with the batch 2 Ambernicks. In fact, I think they basically solved the problem when they made this model here. And so I actually really enjoy these buttons, but if you're looking for something that's even softer and quieter, then I would say the Miyoo Flip definitely wins in that regard. Let's do a quick test in just button force. Now this is very non-scientific. I'm using a kitchen scale. I'm going to press on the button and then I'm going to just wait until it actually goes down and actuates. And once that happens, I'll just kind of look at the grams here and get an idea of what it's actually going to be. So if I had to guess here, it's about 50 grams of force to actuate the button, which is very, very light when it comes to a dome switch. So it feels really good. For the Game Boy Advance SP, it feels very similar, almost identical. So I would say something like 50 or 60 grams of force. Again, very light, very nice feeling. And the new Ambernick is probably somewhere around 70 to 80 grams of force. Still much better than the old Ambernick, which I think was around like 110 or something like that. Like it was a much higher actuation force in terms of grams with this method here. And so this still feels very good, but yes, a little bit stiffer and harder to press down on compared to these other two. And by the way, while we actually have the scale out, we have got 169 grams for the Miyoo Flip, and it's going to be 143 grams for the Game Boy Advance SP, and the Ambernick is definitely heavier, it's 196 grams. So really these are all within spitting distance, but I think that the Miyoo Flip is just a balance between the two. 169 grams, it feels good. Okay, next we're going to do a quick contra test for this D-pad. So essentially I like to press down on the D-pad, then rock it left and right, and yeah, it's not moving the character at all, and this is very expected with a dome switch like this. Is basically you have to actuate the button fully in order for anything to press down on. So you have to be very deliberate when playing with a D-pad like this, which is a good thing. And so you can see that yes, it passes the test. If I push it really far, then yes, I can actually get it to make the character move, but I'm also feeling a little bit of a click when I do that. And so it's giving you that forced feedback every time that you go in any direction, which is essentially everything that you'll always get from a dome switch like this. So no surprises here. And so if you like nice, precise, and clicky controls, then yes, the Miyoo Flip has that in spades. Now when it comes to games that benefit from using diagonals, something like a Street Fighter game here with Street Fighter 3 Third Strike, then yes, this one actually still feels pretty good. You have to be very precise in your movements, so you have to get all three of those clicks in order to get any of these moves to pull off, but once you do, yeah, it totally feels great. Now I personally learned how to play Street Fighter with a Super Nintendo controller, so this is a little bit odd for me just using a dome switch, but it's still very, very precise, so I can appreciate that. So long story short, when it comes to the face buttons and D-pad, yes, they are a dome switch connection, which means they're going to be nice and clicky and precise, and they do feel good. They're nice and soft. Now, one thing worth noting is that the D-pad on the Miyoo Flip does feel a little bit skinny compared to the one on the Ambernick. Now, I've been playing this Ambernick as like my main handheld for quite some time now, and so it's no surprise that I'm kind of feeling the difference between the two just because I'm so used to this red one here, but I just wanted to make note of that it does feel a little bit skinny, but I wouldn't say it's bad. It's just something that probably, again, if I played this a bunch, I would be acclimated to the size of this D-pad instead. So in other words, it is a smaller D-pad, but not to the point that it actually bothers me. Now, in terms of the other buttons, we've got select and start and the menu button. These are all hard plastic buttons, but they do have a soft dome switch click to them as well. So they all feel very good and they're all very, very quiet. That's one of the better things about this device is that it's almost silent to actually play. So you can play this next to somebody else who's sleeping or whatever. And yeah, it's great. Now on the back, we've got our shoulder buttons on the edges as well as our trigger buttons. Now these also feel like they have a micro switch, but there's some sort of rubber bumper in here to make it a lot softer and a little bit mushy. And honestly, these also feel very good. And again, very quiet. This is one of the things that Miyoo is really great with. And, honestly, I like the feel of these too. It reminds me actually of the Miyoo A30, which has kind of a similar layout here, and also that really soft shoulder and trigger button experience. This is actually a little bit softer than the Miyoo Flip, but they are very close. So if you like the feel of these, then it's going to feel nice. It's a bit on the mushy side, but still clicky and tactile. And so honestly, I can't see how they could improve these buttons. I think they feel really good for a small device like this. By contrast, the Anbernic ones are clickier and also a little bit louder. And so these actually are not that bad either, but they do rattle a little bit. And yeah, they just have a little bit more of kind of a clicky and loud texture to them. The Miyoo one doesn't rattle at all. It's kind of silent and then also is a little bit softer. And so I actually like these better than the Anbernic. They don't stick out as much, so they are a little bit harder to find with your fingers as you're playing, but really not a big deal at all either. And so no surprise here, Miyoo knows what they're doing when it comes to D-pad and face buttons. They have kind of nailed it with all these different devices. And so I think that the feel of this is also very good. Even though it is different than these other ones, they still kind of kept their trademark soft, clicky feeling. And these shoulder buttons, I think, are probably the best among the bunch here. And just the fact that they are a really good balance between being soft and clicky and precise and, not being loud. And so really liking the overall controls feel of this device. Okay, now let's do a size comparison between these three. You've got the Miyoo Flip in the center, then the Anbernic RG35XX and then my reshelled Game Boy Advance. Now, you can probably already tell that the Miyoo Flip is closer to the GBA in overall size compared to the Anbernic, which is quite a bit larger. So if you were one of those people who always thought that the Anbernic was just a little bit too bulky, that you wanted something that was closer to the original Game Boy Advance size, then the Miyoo Flip actually is going to do that for you. However, there are some slight design differences that you might prefer one over the other. For example, the Game Boy Advance has that kind of half hinge thing going on. Same thing here with the Anbernic, whereas the Miyoo has a centered hinge. In terms of thickness, we're looking at about 24.5 millimeters with the Miyoo Flip, and that's actually going to be about the same as the original Game Boy Advance SP. Meanwhile, the Anbernic is going to be thicker. You can see this one is 27 millimeters altogether. So again, the Miyoo Flip is a lot like the original Game Boy Advance SP. Same thing when it comes to width. We're looking at 80 millimeters with the Miyoo Flip, and then the Game Boy Advance is going to be actually a little bit more. So this one's a little bit less than 82 millimeters. Meanwhile, the Anbernic is a big boy. Look at that, 89 millimeters. So again, the Miyoo Flip is really that recreation of the Game Boy Advance SP, if that's what you're really looking for. And so, I don't know, I really like the fact that it's a lot smaller in size. And of course, the crazy thing here is that these have the same size screen, and this one actually has more controller options with the analog sticks as well. So the Anbernic just feels a little bit more larger and more luxurious when you're holding it, just because you have all this extra space. So you've got larger hands or whatever, this is probably going to feel less cramped. The Miyoo Flip definitely does feel its size, like it's a smaller handheld, but it is kind of a marvel how much they're able to cram in it as well. And so, I don't know, I kind of like the ingenuity of making something really comfortable to hold and also small. And it's really going to be up to you which one you prefer. I'm very used to using the SP, and so it's going to take a little bit of time for me just to kind of reacclimate to a new handheld. But overall, I'm just happy that we've got two very good handhelds on the market like this. For years, we were waiting for a good clamshell, and for the longest time, it was this stupid thing, the Powkiddy V90. This was like the only one that we had available in terms of use, and this thing is like super underpowered. I did a couple videos about it. It can play like most Super Nintendo games, but some of them are going to be a bit wonky, but it was really cheap. I think it's like a $30 handheld. So this thing was king for a really long time, and I think it still kind of is in the budget space if you're looking for a clamshell, but now we've kind of got the big boys. We've got like nice new handhelds that can play a lot of games and just have a higher build quality as well. So I'm very happy that we just even have these on the market right now. It's pretty cool to have competition like this in the clamshell space. And finally, one other thing worth noting when it comes to the controls and whatnot is that the aesthetics really differ between devices. So you can see that, with this Super Nintendo style one here, we've got a very Super Nintendo look. We've got these black analog sticks, whereas the white one has those white analog sticks and then pastel colors as well for the face button. So it's really going to come down to what you want. For me personally, between the two, I think that I prefer the Super Nintendo one. I like the contrast between the button colors and whatnot and the feel of the textured plastic. And then of course, it's really nostalgic to have these Super Nintendo colors as well. So yeah, this is the one that I would pick between these two. But like I mentioned, I also have the yellow one on order, and I'm hoping that it's going to look a little bit like my yellow Miyoo Mini in terms of the color. And so if it looks like this and it has this yellow color, then and it also has this matte texture to it, then that's going to be the one that I will probably use more than others. I don't have the black one coming in the mail, but I should probably talk to somebody and get that one as well, so I can do the full color comparison between the four. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we jump into the other stuff like the screen and the software, just very briefly, I want to talk about the snap feeling of this handheld because it is kind of unique. Now, first of all, like I mentioned before, the hinge is a little bit different. It's like a full hinge right here with the two pegs on each side. And so it does feel pretty solid when kind of moving it up and down. When you open it up, it's going to click into multiple positions. So you have this position, then this position, and then also all the way back. So we've got 3 to work with here altogether. And then of course here is also a little bit stiff. So you could just set it to anything and it'll stay put where it is. I think in general, most people will either be playing it at this angle, which is going to be more like a laptop kind of feel to it, or I think probably the most common one is going to be this angle right here. This one, for me at least, just feels a lot more natural to use. Now for the original Game Boy Advance SP, it just clicks up to 1, and this is also very similar in terms of angle to the Miyoo Flip. In fact, they look almost identical. Same thing with the Ambernick. It also only clicks back 1 position, and that's also going to be that same position. So this is just kind of your standard playing position, but the Ambernick is unique because it really just wants to go to that one, and so it just kind of goes on its own and flips back to it. This one also has a hard time going all the way back. You can see here that it just kind of springs back, and so some of the older models will stay put, but this new second generation, yeah, they just kind of snap back to this one single angle. So already I'm seeing that the Miyoo Flip just gives you more room to work with. If you want to set it on your desk and, just kind of flip it like this, maybe you're going to watch some old school TV on it, then this is probably going to be a better like laptop angle, but you have your gameplay angle and then you can do 100% or 180 like this. And like I mentioned, it is kind of stiff right here in between the two, and it feels like it wants to snap shut. You can see that right around there, it just kind of goes on its own. And the other thing worth noting is that the feel and the sound of the snap is different than the others. This one has little rubber bumpers up here on the top, and I'm assuming these are probably hiding a screw hole as well, but they are very, very thin. And so when you press down on it and you hear that snap sound, that's not the bumpers pressing against the shell, that is shell on shell contact. So it gives a kind of satisfying snap that is just kind of snapping right into the shell itself. If you look at something like the Game Boy Advance SP as well as the Ambernick, they also have these rubber bumpers, but when you snap it shut, it feels more like it's pressing the rubber bumper instead. So it's got a thunkier, kind of more deep, rich kind of thunk to it. And same thing with the Ambernick one. It's a little bit more bassy in its thunk. And yeah, it feels like it's pressing on these rubber bumpers as opposed to the shell itself. So for me, the Miyoo Flip kind of sounds more like a snap kind of thing. It's like a snappy little handheld as opposed to the other ones which are more thunky. And so I kind of like this feeling, this sound. It's a little bit satisfying to actually use. I feel like I can use this hinge for quite some time. Now, one unique thing about this hinge design in particular is that when you open it up, I found that I often will just kind of naturally hold it like this and then open it up. And what happens is that this little finger right here, my ring finger, as I'm holding it, will get pinched as I'm going right here. So it'll get pinched like that. And it's probably worse on this gray model than it is on the white model because this one is a little bit more matte and kind of grippy. And so I find myself just pinching my finger a little bit, not to the point where I'm like hurting myself or anything, but it is to the point where I have to, pull my finger away. And I think it's because the entire hinge is here on the back. When you're holding something like the SP, you can hold it like this and then open it up and you're not going to get pinched. And same thing with the Ambernick as well. I have never once even thought about getting pinched with this, with either of these handhelds. It hasn't ever come into play. But here in my first 24 hours with this device, I have caught myself, pinched myself at least a half a dozen times when just naturally opening this thing. It's not like I'm trying to pinch myself. And so something to kind of keep in mind is that this overall hinge design is more pinchy than I was expecting, especially right around here. I can find myself pinching my finger as I'm opening it up. I just really have to change the way that I use this device, but I think if I'm naturally doing it, then other people are going to have that same experience as well, so I wanted to bring it up. Okay, so now let's take a look at the stock operating system. So this is pretty common when it comes to these Miyoo devices, and it's a very simple interface to use. So you've got your favorites, you can go into games. So this is going to show all the various systems. So if you pick one like FC, which is Famicom, or NES, we can go in here and we can actually choose our game. We've got box art and everything. And so this has already been preloaded. Like I mentioned before, this had a card already, and I expected it to have games on it, and sure enough, it does. So what you can do here is just kind of navigate through, pick your system, and then pick your game. All your classics are going to be in here. Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, as well as Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Nintendo 64, Neo Geo. We've even got things like Sega Saturn, as well as PlayStation 1. Now the RetroArch one is unique. This is usually something you will find in the stock Miyoo as well. So this will go to different RetroArch cores. And so you can go here. It's going to play the same games, but you can play them directly from the RetroArch core, which is unique. Now, most of these will play via RetroArch as well, not a standalone emulator. So if we were to pull up an NES game, like say let's do Addams Family here, it's probably going to show us a bunch of RetroArch stuff as we open it up for the first time. Yeah, you can see there's the RetroArch menu stuff right there. So it doesn't really matter, whether or not you open it via RetroArch or the game menu. It's going to open up the game, and it might be the same exact emulator as well. And this is all a remnant of the original Miyoo experience, where you had a choice between RetroArch as well as a standalone core. This one, as expected, is mostly just relying on RetroArch because that's what this chipset mostly uses. And I bet if we press the menu button, yeah, we're going to get the exact same menu that we've seen previously. So you can save your save state, you can load up a state, and then we have what they call the native menu. This basically will just bring up RetroArch. And so if you need to go further into the options, that's where I would go. And of course, I've got all sorts of videos about configuring RetroArch and whatnot. And one of the things that's going to be great about the custom firmwares that we will probably see with this device is that they will pre-configure these systems for you. So when you start up something like Game Boy, it's already going to be set up in the way that looks the best for that screen. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm excited about getting something like ArcOS and Rocknix going on it. And because this has Wi-Fi, you'll be able to set that up and then, play with your friends or whatever as well. You can reset your game, and then of course you can exit to go back to the menu. And once you play your first game, you will see that on the far left, we will now have a recents category. So we can go in here, you can just want to cycle through the same 5 games. You can do that without making them your favorite. So that's pretty handy as well. After that, we've got the app section. So this is probably going to have things like, booting into RetroArch, or you can change out the USB input. So this allows you to actually plug this directly into a computer and then transfer files that way. It does look like they also have commercial ports directly on this device. Like you can see here, there is Celeste. That is a bummer. So I would rather they have Portmaster that allows you to add your own game files after you've bought the game, as opposed to having them directly on here. So that just doesn't sit well with me. In addition, we've got a music player. We've got Willy Willy, which is like a media player in China. Yeah, they've even got Balatro on here. I'm not happy about that. In fact, if we go down a little bit further, you can see there are a bunch of ports on here. Long story short, I would prefer that you add your own games to this, and I think it's just a cleaner experience, and then you know where these games are coming from. And you'll be able to use Portmaster to do that. It's an excellent tool that lets you do that stuff with your own commercially purchased games. Regardless, that's what the game layout's going to look like. You've got a bunch of retro games preloaded on here. Then we have a bunch of these other games. And then finally, we have our settings. And so this is where you can do things like changing out your brightness. You can turn on Wi-Fi. You can adjust these screen options too. This has been kind of a hallmark of all the Miyoo devices too. So you want to make it more saturated, you can do that. You want to add the contrast, you can do that as well. In addition, you can change out the language. We've got a few options here. So we've got Chinese and simplified Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and then Portuguese. And that's basically it. So it's always interesting to me that the one European language is Portuguese. Like, where's French? Where's Spanish? But either way, that's what we have, at least in the stock firmware. We've also got the ability to test and calibrate our joysticks. And so you can see here that I've got a full range of motion. There is some cardinal snapping. Like it definitely wants to go in those north, south, west, and east directions, but I can still, go into the diagonal areas as well. And so this actually works out pretty well. There is some cardinal snapping, but not as much as like some of the worst kind of analog sticks from Ambernick and whatnot. We've also got the ability to change out our background music volume. We've also got different themes that we can choose from. I kind of like the stock one, so I'll stick with that. And then it also says that you can use Emulation Station. Let's try this out. So here we are with Emulation Station. And so this is like old school Raspberry Pi style right here, but you can see it has the games in here. And so this makes sense to me because the Rockchip RK3566 chipset, uses a bunch of different custom operating systems that run on Emulation Station. So it makes sense that they've tried to implement this as well. Personally, I think that the best thing that they can do is just get these devices to the developers who have already made like custom firmwares for it, because this probably is not going to be as feature rich as some of the things that they've already set up within the community. Now, if you want to go back, you can go back into the main menu. There's a Use Miyoo UI. And so you can just use that, and then you can quit out of it, and it'll take you back to the original one. And personally, I think this is a little bit more simple and easy to use. And so this is what I'm going to use instead of Emulation Station. Now, eventually I might use Emulation Station, within like ArcOS or Rocknix, but I'm going to wait for those custom firmwares because I think it's going to be just a more robust experience. Now that we have the software running and whatnot, I wanted to check out like sleep mode and whether or not it actually turns off the screen when we close it. So It's probably going to be really hard to capture here on screen, but I'm going to try to close it, and let's see if you can actually, yeah, see right there, the screen does turn off. And so something is happening here where it's going into sleep mode. I'm not sure if it's like goes into sleep and then will finally turn itself off after some time. Again, that'll have to go in the final review, but it is nice to see that there's probably some sort of mechanism either in the hinge or a magnet here in the front that is actually causing it once it makes contact to actually turn off the screen. Now, in terms of game testing, we're going to save a lot of that for the review itself. This is just like my first hands-on with the device, so I don't want to make any judgments right now. But, I will say that, starting up an arcade game like Aliens vs. Predator like this, it is pretty nice that immediately when using it, the analog stick actually works perfectly out of the box. And so very happy to see just that this is working like this. It's a little bit of a stretch, but because it's a smaller device, I don't really mind it. And so I think this is actually a pretty good setup right here. If I was to play this game, like, I wanted to play through it, I would probably use this analog stick over the D-pad. And so I like the ability to have that choice. One thing worth noting is that I'm seeing a little bit of flickering in my camera. You can probably see it right now. This is a mysterious game right here, so don't pay attention to the game that I'm running. But you can see that, yes, this is a 7 out of 10 brightness, and I am getting some PWM flickering. We've seen this with other devices, like the Miyoo Mini also had this problem. And so if you are susceptible to flickering like this, PWM flickering, and you usually know who you are if you are, this does seem to have that on the screen. Now, when it comes to actually playing here, I just wanted to test really quickly how nice this particular game played. And yeah, it feels very good. I can move in all the directions and no big snapping or anything. And then also I can change from walking to running. So all the things that are really important with analog stick-centric games like Mario 64. Whatever this game is. One other thing worth noting is that after playing a few minutes of Nintendo 64, I definitely felt a little bit of warmth right here in the center. And so we'll do a teardown and stuff in the full review and just see, but I'm guessing the chip is right here. And we'll also see how it fares when compared to other devices like the Anbernic one. This one also gets a little bit warm when you're playing some of those high-end systems. So I'll break out my thermal camera and all that stuff, but we'll do that in the final review. At the very least, I think I've gotten all the information that I need about the Miyoo Flip when it comes to the look and feel of it. And I really just enjoy it. Like, there are a lot of things to like about this device. It's a nice compact size. It feels like nice and dense, and it also has really nice controls and whatnot. So I'm really looking forward to messing around with the Miyoo Flip more. There are no deal breakers that I found so far, and that was kind of the first thing I wanted to see. Is there any catastrophic failures with this device that prevent me from recommending it? And as it stands right now, at least in terms of just my first few hours with this device, I'm really liking it. And obviously wait for the final review if you really want to make sure it's going to be worth your money, but I'm really enjoying this. And if you have been waiting for something that's a lot like the Anbernic, but maybe a little bit smaller, maybe with analog sticks, or maybe you just want to have the RK3566, then this little guy is looking to be a contender. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I hope I've covered most of the ins and outs in terms of just the overall impressions, but obviously I've got more things I want to test. So let me know in the comments if there are other things you want me to check out in that final review, and give me a week or two to test it before I make that review. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.